am officially declaring a national emergency.
Apocalyptic images coming out of Australia.
Unfortunately, the U.S. and Iran are getting very close to war.
Kobe Bryant died earlier this afternoon.
An identified aerial phenomenon.
Everyone is vulnerable, right? Spreading worldwide.
This is a global pandemic.
And are trying different ways to contain the virus.
Have been rising.
Way ahead is hard.
Watch the white officer assassinate a black man.
We are Legion. Expect it.
Well, some suffering in the world is not directly because of people behaving badly. It's just that stuff happens. Accidents, tragedies. And we're going to hear now about one person's experience of that and how they came to know God through it. So some people, when they suffer, they turn in anger against God, but others turn to God and they find purpose and peace in Him, even in their suffering. Stef Reid, the Paralympic athlete who was the poster girl for London 2012, is going to share now some of her story for a few minutes. So we are thinking today about where is God in a messed up world, and we're delighted to have Stef Reid, a Paralympic athlete, with us to share something of her experience of life and faith in a messed up world. So Stef, great to have you with us. Welcome. Tell us a bit about what's in your trophy cabinet.
Yeah, so I'm an athlete. I am a long jumper and I compete for Paralympics GB. And do you know, I don't have a trophy cabinet. So I've been competing now for about 13 years at the European level, the national level, the like on the international scene. But the weird thing is, you kind of you win the medal. And then you kind of look at it for a bit and, you know, maybe you wear it around your house and do the dishes with it. And then, I don't know, about a week later, it's just kind of, it's done. And so I've actually got a very unglamorous plastic storage tub that does prevent fire and mold. But I just feel like...
What's in there though? What Olympic medals have you got?
I did bring a few. I did grab them. So I've got one from Rio. 2016. That is a Paralympic silver medal. Actually, the Rio ones are cool because it's
heavy.
Oh, can you shake it? Can you hear that?
Yes, yes.
So what they did in Rio is for athletes who are visually impaired, they actually put different sounding shaker balls in them so they would know what color it was. That was quite cool. And then this one is actually from, and I know because your church is based in London. This is from the London 2017 World Championships, which we had in the Olympic Stadium, yes. And that was actually my first world title. But yeah, the thing is, we don't leave them around the house to look at because I feel like I never ever want to be looking back for the highlight of my life. I always want to be looking forward. So it's cool, you win them, but then you kind of move on.
So speaking about looking forward then, Tokyo not happening this year, that must be a huge disappointment, but how's the training going for next year? It
was tough initially. Just, you know, you kind of have your head geared, it's happening this year. But equally, if you can imagine, I mean, you've put aspects of your life on hold for 4 years for this cycle. And then, you know, another year is a big deal, especially, you know, I'm 35 now and you kind of have to, you know, really consider, okay, like, can I actually do this for another year? So yeah, there was a week of like being disappointed. And then I thought about it. My husband's an athlete as well. He also competes. And we just thought, do you know what? We do want to do this, even though, you know, we don't know what's going to happen next year. I think if anything, that's what the COVID-19 pandemic has shown. There are no guarantees in many ways, but we just thought we would rather try than not. So I've actually been doing a lot of training at home. It looks very different than what your typical long jump training program would look like, but actually I feel like I've made some really good gains and had to be really creative and discovered a few things that I never would have thought of.
Is your garden long enough to be doing the long jump in there?
Do you know what I do regret? You may have remembered Greg Rutherford, who won gold in 2012, and very famously put a long jump pit in his backyard. And I thought, man, he was onto something. No, I don't have a long jump pit, but actually, weirdly, we have a picnic bench, which now I probably use far more for workouts than actually having people sitting around. But you know what? Like I say, you can be creative and you can find a way.
Now, you're a Paralympic athlete because of your accident you had many years ago now. Do you want to just sort of rewind and tell us a bit about what happened?
Sure. So I've always loved sport. I grew up playing everything, but when I was 12, I discovered rugby. And for me, that was it. I wanted to play internationally. That was my goal. And things were looking quite good. I had caught the eye of one of the national coaches, but when I was 15, I was in a boating accident, and I was up at a friend's cottage, and it was for a bank holiday weekend, and unfortunately, we were tubing, and that's when you have an inner tube attached to the back of a powerboat, and I had fallen off, and the driver didn't know that I was in the water, and so I saw the boat coming towards me, thinking he was coming to pick me up, and then I just kind of realized he was going way too fast and he didn't see me. And you kind of just think about your options, and I knew I didn't have enough time to swim to either side, and so I thought I will dive down. I was a good swimmer. I thought I'll just dive down, get as far below the boat as possible, knowing that you need to miss these propellers. But unfortunately, I just forgot I had a life jacket on, and at that point it's just too late, and there really wasn't much I could do except for just hope for the best.
And what injuries did you sustain from that?
So the propellers caught me on my lower back and also my right leg, and I think even at the time, I mean, I knew how serious it was. You could see it in everyone's face. You could see the panic. You could see the blood, and the big issue being we weren't near a major hospital. But I was unbelievably lucky. I eventually made it to a hospital, and so as you can tell from my accent, I grew up in North America, and where I was in Toronto. Super fortunate. They managed to bring in the best orthopedic surgeon in the country, who saved my life. And I had no permanent internal injuries. I had no spinal damage, but unfortunately, they weren't able to save all of my right leg and had to amputate. And
you were 16, 17 at the time?
I was just about to turn 16.
16, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, what impact did this have on you spiritually? So give us an idea of where you were at with God before the accident, and how did that change as a result?
I would have described myself as somebody with a very good head knowledge of what the Bible was, and I knew who Jesus was. I knew his story, but that was probably about as far as it went for me. I didn't get the urgency, and I didn't understand that sense of relationship. I didn't know God intimately. I wasn't really that concerned with what he thought about what I was doing. I didn't check in with him. It was more just, to be honest, my attitude was, you know what, I'm 15, my life is going really well. I kind of feel like God might intervene and ask me to do some things I don't really want to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to carry on living my life as I am. And, maybe when I'm in my 30s and I have a family, and I start worrying about things like dying, and what the afterlife is going to look like, then maybe I'll take that a bit more seriously. And so I think the really hard thing was just, being 15 and, dying was just not on my radar. And many ways it was the terror that I felt in that ambulance, knowing that actually I might not survive this, and I'm scared because I don't know what's going to happen. But mostly I'm scared because, do you know what? Maybe not even just scared. I just felt a deep sense of shame, knowing that I hadn't lived my life as I should have. I hadn't included God. I'd left him on the fringes. I'd done things just really selfishly. And I think it was that sense of shame and guilt that really took me off guard.
Yes. In terms of that changing then as a result of the accident, was that an immediate change, or was it more over time that you came back to the Lord in a more serious way?
I think it was a bit of both. In the ambulance on the way to the hospital was probably one of the most honest prayers I've ever prayed. And it was just, God, help me. Please save my life. I really want a second chance to try and do this better. And I know that God heard that prayer. I know that he saved my life. And I remember waking up in the recovery room just feeling so thankful and just so much joy, and just so thankful for God's grace and God's goodness. And then I got the news that unfortunately the surgeon hadn't been able to save all of my right leg, and he'd had to amputate. And that was just one of the most awful blows you could experience. And it was just weird tension. If I'm so thankful, and yet, God, why would you save my life and take away the one thing that I love most? I don't even know that I want to live or experience life having to give up that dream. I mean, sport was such a huge part of who I was. It just didn't make any sense. How could you be so good, and yet what I was, feeling of just almost, it almost felt cruel. And so I was in this really weird space of, yet still feeling so much of God's peace and hope and trust for the future, and yet being so angry at him. And I didn't know you could feel both.
Yes. And how over the years have you brought those two things together and reconciled them? That, why did God allow this to happen to you? What kind of answers have you come to over the years?
I think, so that would have been in 2000. The accident happened in 2000. So this is me now, 20 years on. And I think I've learned two things. One, God is just, he is slow. The time scale that he operates on. And I think he just gets that, actually, not that he's slow, we're slow. And so he's super patient with us. And again, you're going to have this experience of, just huge growth in this short period of time. And yet it's going to take years to work out. And I think what I've eventually come to realize is God's number one goal for me is to help me to grow into the person he sees that I can be. And probably the best way to describe that is he wants me to be more like Jesus. And so you look at the person Jesus was, he was incredible. He had so much love for people, but he also had just this deep self-assurance and this deep conviction and understanding of who he was and why he was on earth. And it was to love other people well. And I think that is ultimately what God wants for me. And so he has basically, I feel like he has taken and crafted this perfect, I guess some would call it discipleship, you might call it mentorship, but he's crafted this perfect journey for me to do whatever it takes to turn me into, again, the person he always intended for me to be, and just kind of get in and just get rid of those selfish tendencies, those insecurities, those fears. And sometimes the reality is that journey is not pleasant. It's tough, but equally, God is far more concerned with my growth than with my comfort. Christianity doesn't always look fun. The journey doesn't always look like success. But again, that's just not what he intended. And so it's just kind of understanding becoming a Christian doesn't mean that I'm going to have this great, perfect life. And of course it wouldn't. Being a Christian is about following Jesus. And you look at Jesus' life, man, that was rough. He died on a cross in the end. there were many aspects of it that weren't fun. And so it's been hard realizing that my expectation shouldn't be perfection and ease and comfort, but actually it's going to look like what Jesus' life looked like.
And just a final question, and on what basis are you confident that you will be part of that future? So what's your understanding of why you can be sure that God will accept you, although you've messed up in all sorts of ways, as we all have?
Yes, and I will continue to mess up in all sorts of ways. I think sometimes, I guess my confidence is far more in who God is than anything that I do. Sometimes the journey of a Christian, I think it gets harder. And there have been times where I've prayed, God, I honestly think I'm getting worse as a human being. Like what is going on? And I think it's almost more this, I probably gained more of an awareness of sin and of my sin in particular. And part of that is just the growth process. You know, if God showed me immediately the kind of person I was, I mean, that would just be probably really horrifying and depressing. So it's almost like little by little, he kind of drip feeds things in and exposes different things in my heart that I can deal with. And so I know that, I mean, I'm not going to heaven because I'm a good person or because I live perfectly. I mean, I do try, but God, as he said, you know, he can't, sin is not something that he can look upon because he's so perfect. But I know who he is. I know his character. He is good. He is consistent. He sticks to his promises. He does what he's going to say. And he has said, you know, you can access heaven. You can access me because Jesus took it upon himself. And so it's nothing to do with what I've done. It's because of who he is and his promise that I can be confident.
Stef, thank you so much. We know you need to get on with your training and get into your garden and on your bench, whatever it is that you're doing. But thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate you sharing your experience. Thank you.
It's my pleasure.
Peter Hart was a 52-year-old paramedic at East Surrey Hospital who died of COVID-19 in that hospital's ITU on his birthday, the 12th of May. We loved him here at All Souls Church in central London, where he became a Christian and met his wife Helen, both of whom were members of the All Souls Orchestra. This is what Helen wrote to me last week. He found his vocation by qualifying as a paramedic after leaving his job as a management consultant in the city. This enabled him to care more comprehensively for people, literally with a hands-on approach, and it was a perfect vehicle to communicate his love for people. Now, there are around 170 healthcare workers like Peter who attend All Souls, and as I've grieved him and spent the last 2 months seeking to support others on the front line, I wanted to give a voice to what they've been saying to me as they put themselves in harm's way for us all. Let me quote one of our doctors. This is what he wrote to me. As a Christian medic, I long that these patients whose respiratory systems are being decimated have spent some time asking themselves spiritual questions before they're wheeled through the doors of an ITU, as at this stage it's often too late. We care a lot about our patients, and knowing they've asked themselves spiritual questions before they become sick would make a big difference. Another doctor wrote to me and said, the big question is, have we as a church spiritually prepared people for this pandemic? In response to their comments, I've put together a spiritual health check. It's a list of questions that don't monitor the blood pressure, the lung function, the ventilator settings, the pulse and the blood sugar. Instead, they ask, is there hope in your back pocket? So here's a little COVID-19 questionnaire. Interestingly, it goes back 2,000 years because I've taken it from 3 sentences from the letter of James in the New Testament. James was the half-brother of Jesus, who after the death and resurrection of Jesus became a leader of the church in Jerusalem until he was martyred in AD 62. And as we look at these verses, I want to underline the fact that James is not trying to be negative. He's not kicking us when we're down. Rather, he's showing us a way to find certain hope. In chapter 4, verses 13 to 15, he says, now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we'll go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Why, you don't even know what will happen tomorrow. What's your life? You're a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it's the Lord's will, we'll live and do this or that. So the first question James asks his readers, and then in turn the world today, is this: do you still think you're in control of tomorrow? Here in verse 13, he paints a word picture of someone who's absolutely certain about what's coming up in the diary and what's going to be achieved. Can you see this man knows when, where, for how long and why? When, tomorrow. Where, that city. For how long, a year. Why, to make money. So here is the businessman with Google Maps on his iPad in one hand and his mobile phone in the other, and he's certain about what's going to happen and what's going to be achieved in the year ahead. He's got 20/20 vision for 2020. Now, of course, we need to plan. Of course, we need to make a living. Of course, we need to provide for ourselves and our families. But James's target here is presumption. Verse 14, why? You don't even know what will happen tomorrow. Here we are in lockdown, and James questions our presumptions about control. The dictionary defines presumption as arrogance, as taking things for granted. We presume to be in control, that we have a right to certain relationships, to play and watch sport, to travel where we want. These aren't rights, but gifts. So that's question 1 of James's spiritual health check. Do you still think you're in control of tomorrow? Question 2 comes out of verse 14. How would you describe your life? I mean, as you look at your life, how would you describe it? Perhaps as something strong and permanent, like a rock or a tree. Well, I'm afraid James tells his first readers 2,000 years ago, actually, you're more like a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. It's very humbling stuff, because I thought I was more than that. But what we're told to do here is to go into the kitchen, turn on the kettle, and watch it boil. And as you see the steam come out, James says, you ought to look at that and think, just like that steam, in no time I'll be gone. In no time, the doctors and nurses in my congregation will be seeing you in ITU. Again, Helen, Pete's widow, wrote to me. He was well acquainted with the reality of how frail life is, having experienced many terrible situations in the course of his working day, where people were often seriously injured or had died. Now we come to the third question. The first asks, are you in control of tomorrow? The second asks, what's your life? And thirdly, James exclaims, can't you see everything's a gift from God? Verse 15. Instead, you ought to say, if it's the Lord's will, we'll live and do this or that. So what is the deciding factor in our plans? Is it me? Is it down to my will, my gifts, my financial muscle, my network? Well, James tells us that everything is a gift from God. Fun, family, friends, falling in love, food, fitness, they're all gifts, not givens. One of the leaders of the people of Israel 1,500 years before Jesus made the same point to the people of God as they entered the promised land in the Old Testament. They were going to be given a land flowing with milk and honey, and the great danger was presumption. So the Lord warns through Moses in Deuteronomy 8 verse 17, you may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth. So those are James's COVID-19 questions. They speak of the realities that our healthcare workers at All Souls are seeing up close and personal. We may find them pretty overwhelming, but they pinpoint the fact that we've had to reset our thinking and acknowledge I'm not in control, I am a mist, I am dependent on my Creator. But of course, I don't want to leave it there. There's a fourth question. What do I do now? And James knew that his own half-brother, the Lord Jesus Christ, had died by asphyxiation on a cross so that you and I could be forgiven the presumption of past years. For all the times we've regarded God's gifts as givens and acted like the man in James's pen portrait who thinks he has total control over tomorrow and can live as he pleases whilst ignoring the God who sustains him each minute. Not only that, Jesus didn't just die on the cross. It didn't end there. He rose again on Easter Sunday to give us hope in the face of death. So he says by his resurrection, I can get you through death. Trust me. And that future hope is based on a past certainty. Jesus lived and taught and had a band of followers. He was tried in a Roman and Jewish court and sentenced to die. They strung him up on a cross, they put a spear through his side, they took him off the cross and they certified him as dead. They put him in a tomb, and 3 days later he was walking around again. Now, if he got through death himself, he can get me through. Helen, Pete's widow, told me that Pete's favourite hymn was, "In Christ alone my hope is found. He is my light, my strength, my song." And this meant that he had hope in his back pocket in the face of this pandemic, which, as you know, has killed tens of thousands of people in this country and hundreds of thousands of people worldwide, and brought our lives to some extent to a shuddering halt. So as I close, I'm pleading with you on behalf of Peter and our 170 healthcare workers to get the roof on before the storm hits, to investigate what Christ has done as he dies so that your presumption can be forgiven and rises so that you can have hope in the face of death, in the face of the fact that life is so short and fragile. So please take time to investigate further. Perhaps go on a course. There are churches running courses online all over the world. Get in contact, ask any question you like, and there'll be time to find real answers to those questions. And our prayer is that you'll find hope and you'll find real answers to the questions COVID-19 has asked us all.